The GPS didn't just glitch, it hesitated. For 2 full seconds the screen went dark, then reloaded, as if even the signal wasn't sure this delivery was supposed to happen. Behind the wheel of a long, dust-covered horse trailer, Frank Miles felt a knot tighten in his gut. He had driven livestock across 3 states without hesitation, but something about this road, narrow, uneven, disappearing into Montana brush, felt wrong, and Frank trusted his instincts. The papers on the passenger seat said Meadowbrook Ranch, premium destination, high-end buyers, big money, the kind of place with white fencing and spotless barns. But what stretched out in front of him looked nothing like that. No manicured entrance, no security gate, just a weathered sign nailed to a post. Meadowbrook Healing Stables. The paint was peeling. The fence leaned slightly. A handful of modest paddocks surrounded a converted barn that had seen better decades. In the distance, an elderly man in mud-stained overalls was leading a tiny therapy pony at a slow, patient pace. Frank muttered under his breath, "You've got to be kidding me." He parked anyway. Orders were orders, and his truck's transmission had been complaining for the last 50 miles. He stepped down just as the older man approached. 70-something, easy, weathered face, clear eyes, the kind of man who moved carefully, not because he was weak, but because he was deliberate. "Can I help you, son?" the man asked. Frank flipped open his paperwork. "I've got a delivery for Meadowbrook Ranch. 1 gelding. Name's Midnight's Verdict. According to this, he's a top-tier show jumper, valued at just under $200,000. The man froze. Slowly, he pushed his glasses higher on his nose. "Son, I think you've got the wrong Meadowbrook. This is Meadowbrook Healing Stables. We work with injured veterans and special needs kids. The place you're thinking of is Meadowbrook Estates, 40 miles north." Frank felt irritation rise. "Look, sir, I don't get paid to guess. I deliver where the papers say. Once I unload, it's out of my hands." The older man opened his mouth to protest. Too late. The trailer door swung open. What stepped down onto the dirt silenced them both. 17 hands of pure black muscle. A warm blood built like a sculpture. Midnight's coat reflected the fading sunlight like polished stone. Every line of his body spoke of elite breeding, precision training, and years of expectation. But it was his eyes that changed everything. They weren't wild. They weren't curious. They were empty. Not angry. Not afraid. Just done. The older man inhaled sharply. "Sweet mercy," he whispered. As Frank led the horse into a temporary paddock, the signs became clearer. Old pressure marks around the mouth, subtle stiffness in the shoulders, the posture of an animal that had been pushed hard, then pushed past breaking. Frank handed over a thick envelope of documents. "Everything's in there. Good luck." And with that, he drove away. Dust settled. The older man stood alone with a horse worth more than his entire operation, holding paperwork that felt heavier than it should have been. He opened the folder, returned once, returned twice, returned 3 times in 8 months, refuses to jump. Unpredictable behavior, dangerous for competition. One note stood out: beautiful horse, broken spirit, recommend retirement. The man looked up at Midnight's Verdict, who stared past him as if the world had already given up. "Well," the old rancher said quietly, "seems like both of us were sent somewhere we weren't supposed to be." What he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this mistake would change everything. The envelope felt heavier the longer he held it, not because of the papers inside, but because of what they meant. The old rancher's name was Dorian Mallister, 71 years old, former cattleman, former rodeo pickup rider, former everything except what he was now, the quiet backbone of a small healing stable most people drove past without noticing. He didn't deal in competition horses. He dealt in patience, in broken rhythms, in animals and people that needed time more than pressure. Midnight's Verdict didn't fit here, and yet Somehow, he did. Dorian leaned against the paddock fence and watched the gelding stand perfectly still. No pawing, no pacing, no reaction to birds, wind, or the sound of another pony moving nearby. It wasn't calmness. It was shutdown. That's when Dorian noticed something else. The horse flinched, not when Dorian moved closer, but when Dorian raised his voice slightly to call across the yard. Barely noticeable. A tightening around the eyes. A breath held too long. "All right," Dorian said softly. "I see you." That night, he didn't sleep much either. He sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread out under a single lamp. Dates, trainers, facilities, each one more prestigious than the last. Each one ending the same way. Returned. Rejected. Discarded. By morning, the first visitor arrived. His grandson, Elliot Mallister, 30 years old, occupational therapist, and the only reason the healing programs at Meadowbrook still functioned at all. Elliot stepped out of his truck, took one look at the paddock, and stopped cold. "Granddad," he said slowly. "What is that?" Dorian didn't look up from the fence. "That's Midnight's verdict." Elliot walked closer, eyes scanning confirmation, muscle tone, stance. "That's a warm blood jumper, a serious one." "So they tell me." Elliot read through the documents, his professional calm cracking line by line. "These notes, they're not about disobedience. They're about learned helplessness." Dorian frowned. "Say that in plain language." Elliot swallowed. Someone broke him. Not his body, his trust. Midnight didn't move, didn't flick an ear. Elliot leaned on the rail. "You know what happens when horses like this get pushed again?" Dorian nodded. "They explode, or disappear. Or hurt someone," Elliot added. They stood in silence. Finally, Dorian said the thing that surprised even himself. "Then we won't push him." Elliot turned. "Granddad, this horse is dangerous. You saw the notes." "I saw fear dressed up as paperwork," Dorian replied. "I've seen worse in people." That afternoon, a black SUV slowed on the road outside the property. Didn't stop, just slowed. Elliot noticed it too. "Do you get many visitors like that?" Dorian shook his head slowly. "No, but I have a feeling this horse does." As the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road, Midnight's verdict finally moved, just one step closer to the fence. Watching, listening, waiting. That night, Midnight didn't lie down. Dorian noticed it during his final walkthrough. The paddock lights cast long shadows, and the gelding stood exactly where he'd been hours earlier. Same position, same distant stare. Horses slept standing sometimes, but this wasn't rest. This was vigilance. Dorian stopped a few yards away and leaned on the fence. He didn't speak at first. He just existed there, the way you do when you're waiting for an animal to decide whether you're a threat or not. After a full minute, he said quietly, "You don't have to watch tonight." Midnight's ears flicked. Just once. That was the first response Dorian had seen all day. Inside the barn office, Elliot was on his laptop. Research tabs open, training notes highlighted, video clips from old competitions pulled up frame by frame. "Granddad," he said without looking up, "this horse used to fly. Look at this." Dorian watched the screen. Midnight clearing massive oxers effortlessly. Powerful, confident. A different animal entirely. "What changed?" Dorian asked. Elliot's jaw tightened. "Pressure. Owners chasing returns. Trainers chasing results. No one listening when the horse said, 'Enough.'" Dorian nodded. "That happens to people too." The next morning, the first official call came. A man introduced himself as Mr. Halden. Spoke smoothly. Too smoothly. Claimed to represent a logistics oversight tied to Midnight's delivery. "We're prepared to correct the error immediately," Halden said. "A truck can be there within the hour." Dorian looked out the window at Midnight standing alone in the paddock. "No," he said. There was a pause on the line. Sir? No, Dorian repeated. You made a mistake. The horse arrived. He's under my care now. That's not how this works. Dorian smiled faintly. It is on my land. The tone shifted. You're holding a very expensive asset. Dorian's voice hardened. I'm caring for a living being. Another pause, shorter this time. We'll be in touch, Halden said. The line went dead. By afternoon, 2 more vehicles slowed on the road. By evening, Midnight refused feed for the first time. Elliot noticed immediately. He's not sick. He's stressed. Because he knows, Dorian said. Knows what? That they're coming. That night, Midnight did something no one expected. When a distant engine sound drifted across the valley, the gelding walked, slowly, deliberately, toward Dorian. He stopped just short of touching him, head lowered, breath warm in the cool air, not asking for food, not asking for escape, asking for safety. Dorian rested a hand on Midnight's neck. The horse didn't flinch. Elliot watched from the doorway, throat tight. That, he said quietly, doesn't happen by accident. Far down the road, headlights paused, then turned away. For now. But Dorian understood something clearly as the night settled in. This horse hadn't been sent here by mistake. He'd been sent here as a last chance, and someone out there had already decided he wasn't supposed to get one. The pressure didn't come all at once. It came in layers. The next morning, Dorian found fresh tire tracks near the far fence line. Not deep, not careless, just enough to let him know someone had turned around there, slowly, deliberately, like Elliot crouched beside the tracks, jaw tight. They're not locals. No, Dorian said. Locals would have stopped to talk. By noon, an email arrived. Legal language, polite threats, references to liability, insurance exposure, and risk to vulnerable populations. The message was clear without saying it outright. You don't want this horse around children. Elliot slammed his laptop shut. They're setting you up. Dorian nodded. They're trying to make me afraid of doing the right thing. That afternoon, Midnight surprised them again. For the first time since arriving, he moved. Really moved. A gust of wind rattled the barn roof, and a therapy pony spooked in a nearby paddock. Midnight reacted instantly, stepping between the pony and the fence line, body angled, ears alert. Protective, measured, not explosive, controlled. Elliot stared. That's not a broken horse. No, Dorian said quietly. That's a disciplined one. As evening approached, a man arrived at the gate. Mid-40s, clean boots, clipboard, calm smile that never quite settled. Name's Curtis Rowe, he said. I represent the ownership group tied to Midnight's verdict. Dorian didn't invite him in. You're late, Dorian said, and you're not welcome. Rowe chuckled softly. We can make this easy, or we can make it complicated. Dorian crossed his arms. You already made it complicated when you treated a living animal like a failed product. Rowe's smile thinned. That horse is unstable. Then why are you so eager to get him back? Elliot asked from behind. Rowe glanced at Midnight standing calmly behind the fence, watching, listening. Because mistakes like this attract attention, Rowe replied, and attention creates problems. Dorian stepped closer to the gate. You should leave. Rowe hesitated, then nodded once. You've got 48 hours to reconsider. As his vehicle disappeared, Elliot exhaled. They're not going to stop. No, Dorian agreed. They're going to escalate. That night, Midnight finally lay down. For the first time. But Dorian didn't sleep. Because he knew something the men in suits didn't understand. You don't corner a patient man by rushing him. You only give him time to decide how far he's willing to go. And Dorian Mallister had already decided. Dorian didn't wait 48 hours. He waited 6. That's how long it took him to understand exactly what he was up against. At dawn, he walked the property line with a thermos in one hand and his father's old binoculars in the other. Nothing dramatic, no trucks, no men, just the feeling, deep in his chest, that eyes were still on him even when none were visible. Midnight stood at the far fence watching Dorian instead of the horizon. That mattered. Horses watched threats. They followed safety. By mid-morning, Elliot returned from town with news that made the situation sharper. Someone called Animal Welfare, Elliot said quietly. Claimed you're housing a dangerous performance horse without proper containment. They asked about the kids. Dorian closed his eyes for a moment. There it was, the real weapon. Not force, not money, fear. They're trying to turn the children into leverage, Elliot continued. If they can frame this as negligence, they can seize him. Dorian nodded once. Then we remove the risk. Elliot frowned. How? Dorian looked toward Midnight. The gelding lifted his head the instant Dorian's gaze met his, ears forward, waiting. We let them see the truth. That afternoon, Dorian did something no one expected. He opened the gates, not to the men in suits, to the kids. 3 boys arrived first, all male, all different. One walked with braces. One barely spoke. One had hands that shook when the world got loud. Dorian had worked with them for years. Elliot hesitated. "Granddad, are you sure?" Dorian didn't answer. He walked into the paddock alone. No halter, no lead rope, no commands, just presence. Midnight didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. One step, then another. The boys watched from the fence, silent. Dorian stopped 10 feet away and sat down in the dirt. Didn't look at the horse, didn't ask. Midnight lowered his head, sniffed the air, then did something that made Elliot's breath catch. He lay down, fully, exposed, trusting. The boys leaned forward instinctively. One whispered, "He's not scary." That moment was captured, not by cameras, by witnesses. That evening, the SUV returned. This time, it stopped. Curtis Rowe stepped out, eyes scanning the paddock, the children, the horse lying calmly beside an old rancher in the dirt. His confidence cracked. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Dorian stood slowly. "Showing you what you tried to erase." Rowe swallowed. "You're making a mistake." "No," Dorian said evenly. "You did." Midnight rose behind him, towering, calm, unbroken. And for the first time the men who wanted him gone looked unsure. Because now, if TT. Not online, not in the news, through people. By the next morning, 2 fathers showed up unannounced at the gate. Both veterans. Both men Dorian knew well. They'd heard something was going on. They'd heard someone was trying to take the big black horse away. They wanted to see for themselves. Dorian didn't explain. He never did. He just opened the gate and let them walk the fence line. Midnight stood quietly in the paddock, head low, posture relaxed, as if he'd always belonged there. One of the men cleared his throat. "That horse isn't dangerous." "No," Dorian said. "He's honest." That afternoon, the pressure changed shape. Instead of emails, Dorian received a formal notice. Certified. Official. The kind of envelope that made people nervous before they even opened it. Temporary seizure order pending evaluation. They were escalating. Elliot read it twice, then once more. "They're not bluffing anymore." "No," Dorian agreed. "They're desperate." And desperation made people careless. That night, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Not paperwork, not inspectors, something faster. Just after midnight, the sound reached the stables. A trailer. Diesel engine. Heavy. Too close. Dorian was already moving before Elliot reached the door. He stepped into the yard as headlights washed over the paddock. A large transport rig rolled to a stop outside the gate. No logos, no plates visible from the front. 2 men climbed out. Both male, both confident. One carried a clipboard. The other carried nothing. And that worried Dorian more. "We're here for the horse," the clipboard man said calmly. "Court order." Dorian didn't step aside. "You don't have jurisdiction here," he replied. The second man smiled thinly. "Sir, you don't get to decide that." Midnight lifted his head, ears forward, body squared. Not aggressive, but ready. The clipboard man glanced at the horse, then back at Dorian. Last chance to make this easy. Dorian felt something settle inside him. Not fear, resolve. "You're not taking him tonight," Dorian said. "And if you try, you'll have to explain why a calm horse, witnessed by children and veterans, suddenly needed force." The men exchanged a look. They hadn't planned for witnesses. Behind Dorian, lights flicked on. More trucks, more men, neighbors. Someone had made calls. The second man cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he said. Dorian nodded. "I know." The truck reversed, slowly, carefully. As it disappeared down the road, Elliot exhaled shakily. "They'll come back with more authority." "Yes," Dorian said, "which means we stop playing defense." He looked at Midnight, who stood perfectly still, breathing slow, eyes clear. "Tomorrow," Dorian continued, "we go public." And that decision would change everything, because once the truth stepped into the light, there would be no taking it back. Going public didn't mean shouting. It meant choosing where the truth landed. Dorian didn't call reporters, he didn't post videos, he didn't give speeches. Instead, he invited exactly the people the paperwork couldn't intimidate. Veterans, therapists, parents, all male, all steady, all people who understood silence better than noise. They came one by one over the next 2 days. Not in a crowd, not announced. They walked the property, watched the sessions, stood quietly at the fence while Midnight moved among them like he had always belonged there. No rearing, no bolting, no danger. Just a massive black horse lowering his head for a shaking hand. Standing still while a boy rested his forehead against his shoulder. Breathing slow. Grounded. Elliot kept notes. Names, dates, observations. Not opinions. Evidence. By the 3rd day, Dorian received another call. Different voice, different tone. "This is regional oversight," the man said. "We're reviewing conflicting reports regarding Midnight's verdict." Dorian smiled faintly. "You're welcome to visit." A pause. Then, "We will." The inspection team arrived the next morning. 3 men, clean boots, neutral expressions. They expected chaos, liability, something they could write down and control. They didn't expect calm. They didn't expect a 17-hand Warmblood standing motionless while a boy brushed his neck with hands that trembled less than they used to. They didn't expect the horse to lower himself, slowly, carefully, to the ground when Dorian sat beside him. One inspector cleared his throat. "This horse was flagged as unpredictable," Elliot answered evenly. "So were most of the men he's helping." The lead inspector watched Midnight for a long time. Then he asked the question no one else had. "What happened to him?" Dorian met his eyes. Too much expectation. Not enough listening. The report took 2 hours. The silence afterward lasted a day. Then the final call came. Ownership claims withdrawn. Seizure order voided. No further action recommended. But that wasn't the end. Because that evening, a familiar SUV slowed at the gate. Curtis Rowe stepped out. This time, he didn't smile. "You made us look bad," he said. Dorian didn't respond. Rowe glanced at Midnight standing behind the fence. Calm, powerful, present. "You realize," Rowe said quietly, "that if he had stayed broken, none of this would matter." Dorian nodded. "That's usually how it works." Rowe swallowed. "We didn't think he'd come back." "That," Dorian replied, "was your mistake." Rowe left without another word. As the dust settled, Elliot looked at his grandfather. They won't touch him again. Dorian rested a hand on Midnight's neck. No, he said, but they'll never forget him. And neither would anyone else, because the horse they tried to erase had become impossible to ignore. The ranch changed after that. Not overnight, not loudly, but in ways that lasted. Midnight's verdict stopped being the rejected horse and started being the anchor. Wherever he stood, people slowed down. Voices dropped. Breathing steadied. Men who arrived guarded left lighter, like something heavy had been set down without them noticing when. Dorian watched it happen from a distance. He didn't guide it, didn't manage it, didn't explain it. He let Midnight decide. One morning, Elliot approached him with a folded document. "They've updated the registry," he said. "They want to reclassify him. Therapy designation. Permanent." Dorian read the page once, then nodded. "That means he's safe," Elliot added. "They can't touch him." Dorian looked toward the paddock where Midnight stood with a boy resting his palm against the horse's shoulder, eyes closed. "He was always safe," Dorian said. "They just didn't know it." Weeks later, a letter arrived, handwritten this time. No logos, no threats. Just an apology from someone who admitted they'd pushed too hard, chased returns, and ignored the cost. It wasn't signed. Dorian burned it without comment. Some apologies were about easing guilt, not fixing harm. What mattered was what came next. Midnight began choosing who he worked with. He avoided noise, sought stillness, drew in those who didn't ask anything of him except presence. And with each quiet session, the rumors grew. People started driving out of their way, not to see a famous horse, to feel what calm looked like when it stood 16 hands tall and breathed beside you. One afternoon, Dorian found Elliot watching Midnight with a thoughtful expression. "You ever think," Elliot said, "that if he'd gone to the right place originally, none of this would have happened?" Dorian shook his head. "No." Elliot turned. "Why not?" "Because then he wouldn't be who he is now." That night, Dorian walked the fence line alone. Same thermos, same land, same quiet. He stopped at the spot where the trailer had first parked weeks ago. Mistake, they'd called it. Dorian smiled faintly. "Funny thing about mistakes," he said to the wind. "They only look that way if you don't see what they become." Behind him, Midnight let out a low breath, steady, grounded. The ranch lights glowed softly, and somewhere, far away, men who once tried to retrieve a broken asset understood a truth they couldn't undo. You can control what you own, but you can't control what heals. The calls stopped after that. No legal notices, no quiet warnings, no SUVs slowing at the gate. That alone told Dorian everything he needed to know. When powerful people go silent, it doesn't mean they forgot. It means they lost leverage. Midnight's verdict was no longer a problem to be corrected. He was now a presence too visible to erase without explanation. Every man who walked through Meadowbrook Healing Stables became part of the story, an unwritten record that no document could contradict. One cold morning, a new visitor arrived alone. Not a lawyer, not an official. A rancher, late 50s, worn hat, weathered face that carried both regret and humility. He stood at the gate for a long moment before opening it, like he wasn't sure he deserved to be there. Dorian met him halfway. "I'm not here to take anything," the man said immediately. "Name's Caleb Horn." Dorian waited. Caleb swallowed. "I was one of the owners. Not the last one. The first." Dorian felt the weight of that. "He was perfect when I bought him," Caleb continued. "Too perfect. Everyone wanted results. Sponsors, buyers. I told myself pressure was just part of the business." Midnight stood in the paddock behind them, head lowered, listening. "I saw the signs," Caleb said quietly. "I ignored them." Dorian nodded once. "Most people do." Caleb's voice cracked. I didn't know where he ended up. When I heard, I had to see if it was true. Dorian turned slightly so Caleb could see Midnight clearly. Calm, whole, unafraid. Caleb's shoulders sagged. He looks free, Caleb said. He is, Dorian replied. Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. Before leaving, Caleb said one last thing. If there's anything you ever need, feed, land access, money, I owe him that much. Dorian shook his head. Just remember him like this. That evening, Elliot joined Dorian at the fence. That man was important, Elliot said. Yes, Dorian replied, because he came without asking for control. Midnight walked over then, slow, deliberate, and stood beside Dorian, his shoulder brushing the old rancher's arm. A choice. Dorian rested his hand there, feeling the steady strength beneath the coat. This was never about winning, Dorian said quietly. Elliot nodded. It was about letting something broken decide for itself. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Dorian realized something else. Midnight didn't just heal others, he healed the men who failed him, by surviving without needing them. And there was only one chapter left. Because healing, when it's real, always leaves a legacy. The legacy didn't arrive with headlines. It arrived quietly. 1 year later, the sign at the front gate had changed. Not the name, but the meaning behind it. Meadowbrook Healing Stables now carried a smaller plaque beneath it. Home of Midnight's Verdict. People came from across the state. Not crowds, not curiosity seekers, just men who needed space to breathe without being told how. Midnight aged into himself, stronger, broader, still powerful, but softer in the ways that mattered. He never jumped again. No arenas, no applause, and yet he worked harder than he ever had before, standing still, listening, choosing. Dorian moved slower now. His hands shook sometimes, his steps shortened. But every morning, Midnight waited for him at the fence, as if the horse understood time better than people ever could. One winter afternoon, Elliot found Dorian sitting in the paddock, back against Midnight's shoulder. Cold? Elliot asked. Dorian smiled. Not today. They stayed like that for a long moment. When Dorian passed later that year, it wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was peaceful, the way he'd lived. On the day of the small memorial, Midnight stood at the fence, unmoving, head lowered, as men placed hats against their chests and spoke quietly of a rancher who listened more than he spoke. No one led the horse away. No one needed to. Afterward, Elliot approached the paddock alone. You did good, he said softly. Midnight lifted his head and stepped closer, breath warm in the cold air. Years later, new boys would arrive, new hands would tremble, and Midnight would still be there, grounded, patient, present. A horse once labeled dangerous, once rejected, once sent to the wrong place, who turned out to be exactly where he was meant to be all along. Some mistakes aren't errors, they're corrections.